In our last lesson, we talked about who God is. And when we meet God, we realize pretty quickly that we have a problem. There's a few accounts in the Bible of people encountering God and instantly sort of wanting to hide or have God, don't look at me, don't interact with me because when we encounter a perfect and holy God, it puts into stark relief the fact that we are not perfect and holy. We have a problem. And the Bible defines that problem for us as something that we call sin. The world will have its own answers, and in class we're going to discuss what you think a little bit about what the world would say, what our culture would say, and what we would naturally say. But the Bible gives us a pretty clear answer to what the problem is, and that is sin. So in this video, we're going to define that out. My most basic definition of sin is any attempt in our life to take God's place. Any attempt to take God's place. If God is our, by his nature, our standard of right and wrong, if he's the one who defines good and evil, then sin is saying, no, I will define it for myself. I will call the shots in my life. I will lead my own life. If God is the only one worthy of glory, sin is anything that tries to take glory away from him and put it on anyone else, another person, or more likely on myself. I will make others about me. I will get attention for myself. I will focus on myself, meditate on myself, build my own reputation at all costs. I will take from you to feed me. That's that heart of sin. And even in our humility, we can be doing the same thing. Even our humility or our attempts at humility can actually, under the surface, be just such a focus on myself. And the implication sometimes is that I'm not good enough, I'm not enough, I'm so lame, I'm so terrible. And the implication of that can be I'm trying to solve my own problems and be enough for everybody and, fulfill everybody's expectations of me and fulfill my own and fulfill God's. But I'm not doing it, so I'm humble. But under that humility is really, it's just a disguise for us glorifying ourselves, even in the idea that we could be the solution to all things. And so even in that, we can be sinful by trying to take God's place of glory in our lives and in the world. And so you have there on page 2 where it says in the box, taking God's place. That's how I want us to, at the very basic level, that's how we want to define sin, is any attempt to take God's place in our lives. That begins way back in Genesis 3 in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve, their temptation was to be like God. You can go read that in Genesis 3 if you want. But that's what they wanted, is to be like God. In then their attempt to be like God, they're actually rebelling against what God told them. And the result is that they become separated from God. Their relationship with God that they had, where they had no fear of God, where they would hang out with God, that all of a sudden is broken, as is their relationship with one another. They now are ashamed of themselves. They now are blaming each other for things. They now live, all of a sudden their nature has been twisted. And so sin has these really stark effects that we see in our lives. And that's how the Bible would describe, where does all our insecurity come from? Where does our pride come from? Where does our violence come from? It comes from this act of rebellion against God that repeats itself and perpetuates itself, so that sin has these really powerful effects in our lives. However, sin is not a matter so much of the effect as it is of the cause. And you have a little box there that describes that. Here's what I mean by that. We sometimes think of sin as something that is, if it has a bad result, then that was sin. So an analogy that I use is in our legal system. If I try to shoot at you and I miss, I can be arrested for attempted murder, but I can't be arrested for murder because there was no effect of murder. I didn't actually kill you. You didn't actually die. Therefore, it can't be called murder. God, though, doesn't see it quite that way. And if you look in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is going to define sin in really more scary terms, because he's going to say it's actually, sorry about that, actually an intent of your heart. If I intended to kill you, it's really the intent is the same. He says it of lust. I may not have committed adultery, but if I commit lust in my heart, my intent is the same, and therefore the sin is the same. What we could boil that down to is saying sin is not about the outcome, the effect. Sin is about the cause in my heart that rebels against God and calls the shots in my life and wants my own way and puts myself in the place of God. And so we really need to be understanding of what the Bible is saying about sin, is that it's a corrupted heart. It's a twisted heart that's wrapped around itself, wrapped around its own desires, its own well-being, that has tried to take God's place. And so that's when we go, okay, is this or that a sin? Should believers do this thing? Should they not do that thing? Is this or that a sin? Is this or that sinful? That's really not the best question. The best question is, where's my heart at in this? And so sometimes as a newer believer, you'll be asking people, hey, is this okay or is that okay? And you'll get Christians with different answers. Hey, is it okay to drink alcohol? You'll have some who say no and some who say yes. Is it okay for me to watch this movie? Some will say no and some will say yes. But that's not really the best question. The best question is, what's behind that? What's in your heart? What is your motive? Why are you drinking the alcohol? Why are you watching the movie? What are you hoping to get out of it? Is it for your own gratification only? Is it for your own? Is that movie what's going to be helpful and build your soul? Is it going to turn your eyes to what is right and true? Is it causing you, all kinds of difficulties? What's your motive? What's your hope in that? That's a harder question sometimes to answer, and that can be frustrating when we just want real black and white answers. Christianity often doesn't offer us these super black and white, clear-cut answers to things that we thought it would, because it's not about a code of conduct as much as it is a check on your heart. And that's what we're talking about here when we talk about sin. Not about the outcome as much as about the motive, okay? Jeremiah 17:9 there you have in your booklet, it says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? And so we are messed up from the inside out. We are broken from the inside out. Sin is not an external thing. It's an internal problem. And so we can try to make external solutions and, get rid of and cover up and take away all these bad things around us and make our environment so pure and perfect. But A, that's not realistic. And B, you can put me in a room all by myself with no windows, and I'll still find a way to sin in my own mind, in my own heart, in my own intent, in my own putting myself in the place of God. And so we need something that will fix us then from the inside out. On page 3, I talk about sin as a state and a status, So both of those. So first, as a state, if sin is us being broken from the inside out, then sin is a mode that we walk around in. It's a state that we walk around in. It describes our very nature now, not our original intent that God designed us with. But now our nature, the Bible tells us, has been corrupted ever since Adam and Eve tried to take God's place. Each person then is born with this self-centeredness. And if you've ever been around kids, you realize that they are born completely self-centered and they do things that are wrong and crazy and bad. Now, I should pause here and say I don't believe, and many Bible scholars don't believe then, that if a child dies, that child is condemned to punishment, condemned to hell, separated from God, that God has mercy. The Bible does have a theme of being judged more for the more you know and less for the less you know. And while the Bible describes us being born with a natural state of sinfulness, not an original design of sinfulness, but a natural state that we brought on ourselves through Adam and Eve. The Bible also has at least one case of somebody who responds to the death of a child with hope that they will see that child again in heaven. And so I think it's worth pausing there, that God is merciful, and that's part of this lesson as well. But nevertheless, the Bible does describe us born sinful, selfish, and trying to be God in our lives. And so sin is a state that we live in. Sin is also a status. So I want you to think of this picture of an army rebelling against a king. So there's a good and perfect king, and you and I are part of a rebel group that's trying to overthrow him, kick him off his throne, get rid of him, and put ourselves on that throne. That's what we do against God. We rebel against him. And so as a result, we are either in God's eyes seen as his beloved children or as like a rebel army against him. And there's really no middle ground. We're either one of those two things. And it doesn't really matter if we, do something good. That doesn't help us not have this label of sinner. So I give you the picture there in your handbook of if we're rebelling against that king, it doesn't help if we go, okay, but I painted the castle wall for you, right? But I did a nice thing. Well, so what? That doesn't help the fact that we are treasonous, that we deserve to be executed by the king. And so we have a state of sin in our nature, so that all that we do is really boils down to a selfish state, even if we do nice things. And we also have a status of sinner, so that no matter what we do, we still have that label while we're still in rebellion against God. And so we're going to talk in this lesson later about what it would take to not have that anymore. We also talk about idolatry. Now, idolatry means something a little bit, or it looks a little different in the Bible and especially in the Old Testament than it does in our hearts. But idolatry is really putting anything in the place of God. And I would put it this way. In the Old Testament, it's statues, little things that they would sacrifice to. Sometimes it was really just evil, demonic, what they were doing. It involved fornication, it involved killing children, it involved harming themselves. It's just this horribly dark thing, this idol worship. But it's also so silly. In the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament talks about how you're worshiping something that clearly you made, you carved, you built that thing. You made it out of wood. It can't speak, it can't see, it can't hear. Why not turn to the true and living God who can see, speak, and hear and have relationship with you, who is not made by your hands, but instead whose hands made you? And so idolatry in that sense seems silly to us, but shouldn't it also seem equally silly if we think of idolatry as putting anything in God's place? And so I'm not going to help you with some examples, but I want you to reflect there on the page about what are some things that you think we, or even you specifically, may put in the place of God. And those could be, by the way, just to give you a hint here, those could be perfectly good, nice things. Okay, it doesn't have to be violence. It could be something totally acceptable, but not something that deserves to be put in the place of God in our life. And so I want you to think, and I'll probably ask you for some examples when we get into class, but you can look at it that way. That's what we would call idolatry, anything we put in the place of God. One more note on this. Ultimately, we're either putting ourselves or God in that place. So even if I put something else, someone else, an idol, a thing, a person, something else besides me in God's place where I serve it, I worship it, I pay all my attention to it, I give it all my affection, my time, my money, my focus, I care about its opinion, I fear it more than all else. Even if I put something else in that place of God in my life, ultimately what that's doing is it's saying, I will choose what gets to be in God's place. And so ultimately, when we boil it down, it's still me putting myself in God's place because I'm saying I will choose to put this in God's place. And because I'm choosing that, I still ultimately am putting myself in God's place as the chooser, rather than saying only God deserves God's place in my life. Okay. We talk also on this page 3, about being slaves to sin. So Jesus says there at the bottom in John 8:34, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. Sometimes sin and some of these things and pursuing our own desires, the idea we get in our head, the lie that we get in our head is that that's where freedom comes from. If I can do whatever I want, I'm free. And if you're in this class, I hope that you've already experienced in life that when you get to do whatever you want, you're really enslaved. It's counterintuitive to us, but it rings true in our experience that when I get whatever I want, I'm a slave then to my own desires, and I'm not free at all. The Bible actually, and we'll talk more in a later lesson on how God changes our life after we come to faith in Him. The Bible talks about self-control and no longer living for our desires, but living for God and His desires. Talks about when we try to find our life and cling to our life, we end up losing our life. But when we cling to Jesus, we find our life. And so we'll talk more about that later. But I want to introduce you to the idea here that the lie that we tell ourselves and that we get told is if you can come to a place where you do whatever you want and gratify yourself, you will find freedom. And the Bible says, no, that is the path to slavery to your own desires and not the path to freedom at all. So the Bible describes us as slaves to sin in the sense that because sin is our nature, we can't not sin. We can't not, and you've been people and you've known people who can't really conceive of not just pursuing what I want to do or not. Why would I not do that? That's what I want. That's what seems best for me. That's what would make me happiest. Why would I do something different? I don't understand. That's because we are bent that way. And it will show up even sometimes in places that we didn't expect. Our selfishness and our inability to get out of this nature of sin shows up sometimes in places that we begin to realize more and more, or see them more and more for what they are once we've turned to Jesus. And so maybe I would ask you to ask yourself, have you come to that place? Have you come to the place to be able to say, wow, yeah, I've tried that and it didn't work? Or are you still going, gosh, if I could just have what I want, then I'd be truly free? And God must, because He's so nice, He must be about giving me what I want and what makes me happy. God is not all about making you happy. He's about making you whole. He's about giving you abundance of life, John 10:10 says. But abundance of life and making you whole and giving you a relationship with Him does not mean, we'll talk about this in a later lesson, but it doesn't mean that you'll always be happy. It actually means that you'll suffer, but ultimately you'll have true, full life and full joy in Him. So all this seems kind of counterintuitive and paradoxical to us, but I would say, have you already experienced that? Have you already seen that is the case? All right. On our next page, page 4, you have this verse here that says in Romans 6:20 and 21, I give it to you in the New Living Translation, when you were slaves to sin, you were free from the obligation to do right. And what was the result? You are now ashamed of the things you used to do, things that end in eternal doom. Meaning, when you lived a life that was just about what you wanted, that was just about your desires, that was just about calling the shots and having your way, you found yourself enslaved to that, and you were free in the sense of you didn't have to do what was right. Now, the Bible's not saying there that it doesn't matter and you don't have to do right. There's no requirement for doing right on those who rebel against God. That requirement is still there. We're still judged for that. What it's saying is you lived in a world where that you completely ignored all of God's ways and lived for your own. And now we regret those things. We look back and we go, I wish I could undo that. I wish I could have those years back. I wish I could take back my words, take back my actions. I'm ashamed of that. But actually what we're going to see in the next video is that we can take that shame, we can take those regrets, we can take all of that, and we can give it to Jesus and let Him take it away so that we don't live those lives of regret, but live new lives in Him.